they have been involved in regime changes throughout, and there's none that you can really recall in recent memory that has been successful. Why do they think that this one is going to be successful?
Well, I mean, every one of these coup attempts is a gamble. By particularly the United States is not trusted anymore, and I think it's fair to say after the 2016 failed coup attempt in Turkey, anybody that is allied to the United States, and that includes us here in Britain, has got a very close eye on whether or not we should be trusting our US friends or not at any particular time. The Erdogan government has a lot of military ties to the United States, and it still does. It's in NATO, and yet still a NATO ally was prepared, it seems, to come into Turkey in 2016 and to attempt to depose the president. Now, and I'm sure all other American states who are allied, for example, who have US bases, as the Turks do, with the United States, is aware of this, not to mention other countries that are very much under the target of the United States, like Venezuela has been, and obviously countries like Iran understand that, and Lebanon, other countries like this, understand the US is doing everything it can to bring them under its control. But actually what's happening, I think, in the bigger picture, the wider picture, is the world is waking up to the despotism from the Pentagon, the arrogance of the United States. It's like, I think, any dying empire. It's been very powerful in the past. Its people had an incredible standard of living in the 1960s and 1970s. But from that point on, really, 1980s, 90s and up till now, the standards of living in the United States have dropped and dropped and dropped. And so the people in charge find themselves less and less supported by their own population. And they look to divert their energies and their efforts away and abroad in order to try and grab resources to prop up their economy by grabbing resources from foreigners. And this, I'm afraid, they're on a hiding to nothing. They're not going to succeed in this attempt, because the world is waking up to exactly what the United States is up to. And nobody, although many people will be giving very fair words to the United States, very, very few countries, including our own, will really 100% be trusting them. We have a dispute going on just this week, a very high-level one, over whether to use Chinese technology in our internet systems here in Britain, and the British have decided we're going to do what we want, not what the US want. So there is a bit of a pushback starting to take place against US hegemony, and that is, I think, the signals the beginning of the end of the empire. What we've got to watch, though, is that the empires like this generally tend to lash out in very aggressive and very unpredictable ways, specifically when they realize that they don't have the power that they thought they have. They tend to believe their own propaganda. They sit and watch CNN and NBC, ABC in the United States and pat themselves on the back and say, aren't we doing well? And actually, they aren't doing very well, and they're believing their own propaganda far too much. So let's see what happens in Venezuela. I think, but certainly by the looks of it, the army is pretty solidly behind the president, Maduro, and against Guaido, which is fascinating to see, because that could have gone either way. And also, the other thing is that it looks like Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, who the Americans want to be president, is being shown to have simply got it wrong. And this doesn't do anything for his credibility whatsoever.
Let's bring in our correspondent, Jesus Silva, to find out what is happening in Caracas. Jesus, what do you have for us? Jesus Silva. It looks like we do not have Jesus Silva. So live from Caracas, you're looking at the images there, thousands upon thousands that have come out in support of the Venezuelan government. At this point, this has been pretty much something that has been the case throughout the scenario that's involved Venezuela for the past years now, where you do have a lot of people who, as much as they're suffering from economic hardships, some may be attributed to the mismanagement by the government, but a lot of it also has to deal with the sanctions that the U.S. has placed, not allowing this economy to propel or move forward, but still they are in support of their government because they do not want what will ensue were there to be any type of change. That's not something they obviously support. The Venezuelan army in the past 30 minutes. Okay, we do have our correspondent Jesus Silva ready to join us. Jesus, over to you. What do you have for us?
Opposition protesters are holding violent clashes against security forces, specifically in Altamira area, which is an opposition territory known for holding many violent protests.
Yeah, we're having problems with Jesus Silva, our correspondent. Tony Gosling, back to you. So, what is next here? I mean, at this point, the situation is somewhat still fluid. But if this dies down, doesn't that, in a sense, take away credibility when it comes to the opposition and the U.S. in turn and the backers of Juan Guaido?
Well, of course, that's what I was coming on to say, was that these coups, as happened in Turkey, can backfire enormously. If it's an attempted coup which fails, what happens is that the perpetrators abroad just simply lose all credibility. They lose trust amongst their allies. And I think we just need to look into what this really means in the bigger picture, and less standing of the United States in the world. Of course, we saw here in Britain the arrest of Julian Assange just a couple of weeks ago, and this has almost fallen off the headlines. But Julian Assange has also made an enormous difference in exposing the lies of the American secret state, the attempt to put the entire world, really, using things like the Android system on mobile phones, using Samsung televisions, hacking into cars, hacking into aircraft in order to assassinate people covertly. So we've seen really, I suppose, the seamy underbelly, thanks to Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and others, of exactly what the United States is really all about behind the scenes. We get this glossy Hollywood image, and actually I must say most of the Hollywood films these days are very two-dimensional. I'm afraid it was quite good Hollywood films in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But nowadays, they're very, very empty. But anyway, people still watch them, and they think that this glamorous side is what America is all about. Actually, the United States has really now nothing much to do with that. They have taken on the mantle, I'm sorry to say, of the 1930s Nazis, but only not in all ways, but when it comes to grabbing territory and grabbing countries. This is what made Hitler notorious in the 30s and 40s, was just taking over countries, annexing Czechoslovakia, taking over Austria, moving into Poland for no apparent reason other than just to grab territory with puny excuses. The United States is now the country in the world that has taken on this mantle. And the idea that somebody like Donald Trump is really in charge, I'm afraid, is laughable. He is really just there as a kind of figure to put on the stage, to make a few statements, and he's also very much under duress. As you know, with the Mueller inquiry, he's had a constant pressure on him to have his private affairs revealed in public, and this is simply a way that the deep state in the United States and in the Western world more generally, in the UK and in Israel particularly, can put pressure on the president through blackmailing him to do X, Y, and Z. And I think this has probably played a major part in getting the Golan Heights, for example, the United States recognizing those in Syria. And so the US credibility has been blown to smithereens by people like Julian Assange, who've turned all those fevered conspiracy theories that people used to have back in the 1990s and noughties into facts. He's shown many of these suspicions that people like myself had about US surveillance and US covert assassination techniques are now proven as facts. And that's why the people like Assange are being hunted down like criminals. Actually, he's one of the most brilliant publishers and journalists in the world. And I think it'd be interesting to see just how much the British do what the Americans want with Assange, because this is a key side of this. Can the Western media actually be critical of America? And if it can't, I'm afraid we are lost in this part of the world. But I believe it's possible that the British courts will not side with the United States. We have to be assertive about our own sovereignty and look after people in this country, and not simply do what the bullies in the United States are doing in Britain, just as they've been doing in Caracas, Venezuela today.
Do you think the fact that the opposition leader Guaido called for a military uprising has failed since we had the army come out and they have pledged their support for Nicolas Maduro?
Well, look, let's just be careful, because we've seen them on the TV. That doesn't mean to say we've seen everything that's going on, because, of course, the control of the television station in the major country, in the capital, is one of the most important ways that you can actually control a country. If you control some of the key military, you control the television, you control the major airports and the media, actually you pretty much control a country. So those are the key things which need to be taken over if there is to be a coup. So I think we just need to be a little bit cautious, because if someone comes on the TV, we don't necessarily know that there are other things going on behind the scenes. This is what, one side is projecting up to the public. This is what you're seeing on television, and I think we just need to be a little bit cautious before we see, before we draw to any conclusions about whether that fully reflects the wider picture of what's going on in Caracas. But certainly it seems that the army and the government are pretty much together. So that is to say, the president and the armed forces are on the same side, and that they actually do have control of the country still, and that the early signs are that this coup attempt has been a failure. And that, of course, will massively backfire on US influence in Caracas, in Venezuela, and it will actually bring more and more people, particularly in that part of the world. And I'm not just talking about Venezuela. Many others will be looking, the members of the public, looking at what's going on in Brazil and Colombia and other South American countries, and suddenly it may even be that Maduro gets even more support from the ordinary South American people because of what he's done. And that, of course, is very important. Winning hearts and minds is what the Americans have tried to do over the years, and they've been trying to do it using propaganda and psychological warfare right across the West. And actually, they failed. It looks as if here they're failing miserably with that. And when a propaganda attempt backfires, that actually is far, far worse. It's almost as if the generals will be scratching their heads, looking at each other and saying, well, maybe it would be better if we just let the Venezuelans get on with it and done nothing at all.
Thank you very much, Tony Gosling. We appreciate your comments. Investigative journalist Tony Gosling there talking to us. We're going to bring in now Keith Preston. He's an independent journalist and researcher who joins us. Keith Preston, there was a military uprising that was called by the U.S.-backed opposition leader who claimed himself to be the president, the interim president. Do you think that has failed now that the army has come out in support of the Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but at this point, that does seem to be the case. And it's doubtful, though, that there was ever really a real coup attempt in process. What we do have happening is a situation where Juan Guaido has called for an insurrection by the military against the government of President Maduro. Now, whether that was ever a realistic objective is questionable. There may be some support for the Venezuelan opposition within the military, but by all accounts, ever since this crisis started, the evidence has shown that the overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan military is aligned with President Maduro. Now, an additional factor comes from the fact that Guaido is seen as being backed by the Americans. Now, American interference in the domestic affairs of Latin American countries has always been extremely unpopular with Latin American people, ranging from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest oligarchs in many instances. So the fact that Guaido has been moving closely to the United States and is consequently being seen as largely a front man for American interest in Venezuela certainly has the effect of undermining his credibility.
So the U.S. has been planning this now for quite some time. We know that even during the time when Mike Pompeo was the CIA director, he was making trips to Latin America trying to rally support behind the U.S. plans for what they obviously hope to be a regime change in Venezuela. Do you think that, given the fact that we're looking at what is unfolding now, Of course, here we're looking at scenes, sorry, Keith Preston, just to point out, on the streets there in Caracas, a bus seems to now be on fire. But if this particular effort fails by Guaido today, doesn't that take away any authority or credibility that he may have when it comes to its ultimate goal of gathering Venezuelans' support behind him? Because this has been going on for quite some time, and yet has not yielded the results that the U.S. wanted.
Well, if Guaido fails to initiate a coup in Venezuela, yes, that really means that the game is over. Because what it comes down to is, what will the military do? Will the military stand with President Maduro, or will they stand with the opposition? And so far, every indication is, and has been the whole time this has been going on, that the military stands with the government of Nicolas Maduro. So if Guaido is trying to incite a military insurrection, he may be overplaying his hand. He may be essentially undermining his own credibility in the process, because if what he's calling for fails to happen, then he is largely discredited as a viable opposition figure. It does show that the military forces are going to remain in the camp of the president. So there's really very little he can do after that in terms of maneuverability. His credibility will be totally undermined.
And also the international consensus when it comes to maybe opposing Nicolas Maduro is as hard and as and emphatic in not wanting any type of military intervention. Even Brazil has come out stating solidarity with the protesters, but at the same time rejecting military intervention. This type of language, however, doesn't lead to having the opposition and the government talk. Do you think that there's a chance for talks to perhaps resolve the situation? Something, for example, that Iran has said, and even Russia.
Well, there's certainly a chance for talks, but what matters, though, is the atmosphere of this particular series of events. It's certainly true that none of the countries in Latin America want an American intervention in the internal affairs of their own nations. I mean, the leadership of all of the Latin American countries understand that if the Americans are going to interfere in the domestic politics of Venezuela, they can just as easily do it in the domestic politics of any other country in Latin America, and they have done so going all the way back since the 19th century. So the conflict between Latin America and between American imperialism is a long-standing, centuries-old conflict, and very few figures in Latin American politics really want that to happen. Now, in the case of Brazil, you mentioned Brazil, that's an interesting case because of the Bolsonaro government, which is heavily aligned with the Trump administration in the United States, and also with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. So that's something of a special case. But for the most part, though, no one in Latin America really wants American interference. And if as long as the Americans are pressing for regime change in Venezuela, it's very unlikely that there's ever going to be any kind of peaceful settlement or talks or anything of that nature, because of the fact that Guaido will simply be seen as an American puppet, and that's going to undermine any credibility he has with either the Maduro government, with the Venezuelan people, with the various other nations in the area.
Okay, we're bringing our correspondent now, Keith Preston, to get an idea about what's going on there in Caracas. Jesus Silva, can you please update us on the situation there?
There are zones in Caracas where violent clashes are being held. According to government sources, those clashes have been waged by opposition leaders. These protesters are launching Molotov cocktails against security forces of the Venezuelan state. But so far we can say that the top commanders of the military force, I'm speaking about Minister of Defense and also commander of the army, have ratified their total support to President Maduro as the only president that Venezuela has. So the attempt by the opposition trying to produce a military coup has not been successful so far. Operations of this kind have been tried in the past and they have become unsuccessful. But in the media arena, in social media, and also in foreign TV channels, the opposition has again taken an important place, making millions of people believe that their attempt of ousting Maduro will be successful this time around. So according to the officials, I think that in the upcoming hours, we will find that this attempt by the opposition to destabilize the country will be finally unsuccessful.
Has the government made any announcements regarding how they want to approach this situation? And as we were seeing, there are security forces out on the streets. Are they going to deploy more? Any particular tactics that they have announced that they're going to use? And also, if we're going to hear from the Venezuelan presidents.
As I said earlier, there are zones in the capital, Caracas, where the opposition has historically held violent protests. I'm speaking about Altamira Square, Altamira Sector, La Carlota Airport. I'm not speaking about inside the airport, in the airport, but the surroundings. So in this complex, they are holding violent protests. They have some masked men throwing Molotov cocktails and clashing with the military force, trying to inspire other people to join them and to convert this situation into a nationwide situation, which is not yet the situation so far, because on the other hand, you can see that there are thousands of supporters who support Maduro, who support the government, who are approaching presidential palace to hold a massive support demonstration in the defense of the Constitution, in the defense of the Venezuelan democracy, and also in the